Welcome to a tutorial video on JavaScript and Ink. In this video, I'm going to talk about getting and setting variables. One of the more interesting aspects of working with the Ink API is we can actually access variables directly using the API and change them during runtime. So let's take a step back for a second and look at some Ink code before we get into the working with the JavaScript API. So we see here I have a very similar example that we saw in the previous video. This time though, I've added an extra variable. See var name equals Dan at the top, line 1. Then we see in line 8, we should see he turned to me, what should we eat, Dan? This is what we expect to see because that's the variable name and its value is Dan. So if this was run within the Inky editor, we would expect to see right here, what should we eat, Dan? Let's come back to our example code. Again, we're using the Node interface, looking at the JavaScript API before in later videos we come back to HTML and talk about interfaces a little bit more. So we're following the same things I talked about in the previous video. We're loading story object, loading file interface here, using read file sync to load the JSON file that was compiled using the Inky editor. We've got that here. And down here, we're loading that JSON into a story. And then we're doing something new. Right here on line 13, we're accessing variable state and changing a value. Right here, this property, variables state, variables with an S, is a proxy interface to all of the variables that exist during the runtime of the story. While it's running, all variables are global. And so we can access them, get those values, or even change their values. Here we see an example of that. Line 13 looks for the variable named name and changes whatever its value was to Steve. Now let's look at this in practice. In this very next line here, we continue, we get the next chunk of the story. This is what we expect to see. It was our first date and we had made dinner plans. Then we were returning the next chunk. Let's run this. He turned to me, what should we eat, Steve? This is an example of accessing those variables. Again, because they're global, we can reach in and change them. We can also reach in and get their values. This is particularly interesting if you want to expand out using Ink with JavaScript for other projects. I'm going to talk about in later videos building an interface layer and working between a JavaScript layer and Ink layer and how that might work. This is the first step towards that. We can create our Ink story, compile it through using other tools or the Inky editor, produce the JSON that we need, and then when it's running within the JavaScript runtime, reach in and change those variables or reach in and get them. For example, if we wanted to keep track of a certain amount of points, or if someone had found a key and then react in a certain way, or we could even use it to keep track of dialog flags. For example, if we had a dialog system set up, JavaScript was running it, we could keep track of what people had picked up, who they had talked to, through variables, and use this same interface, this variable state and the name of that variable, to see what those variables were, and then react in real time, using Ink to drive the dialogue, the narrative part, and using a JavaScript API layer to react and talk to other things, maybe a graphic system or something else like that, that would then react to those variables as it saw them during runtime. So as a review, this video doesn't cover a whole lot, but it covers one very important aspect of the API, this variable state interface. We can check to see if a variable check to see the value of a variable, or even change it in this case. And all of this happens during runtime, because we're in fact running the story using an Ink.js runtime system in JavaScript. So it's running along, and we're using the API to reach in and not only get the next chunk of story using the continue function, but also changing or seeing the values of different variables. An important aspect, a simple but important aspect of working with the API using JavaScript and Ink. Thanks for watching.